So what are some of the nuts and bolts of the Chinese Communist Party that need to be unscrewed, kicked?
Well, first, where in history has it been where some of the richest people in the country fall off skyscrapers or start disappearing? So once the party's own billionaires realize they are no longer safe, and their money's no longer safe, and their assets are no longer safe, their lives are no longer safe, there's a real friction point within the elites of the party that you can play them off against one another. And the fact that so many of these guys have fallen off buildings and disappeared and so forth. The same thing with sports figures. So when some of the most popular or high profile or entrepreneurial people who are sort of the party, but not necessarily part of the party official machine, they have their own private prestige and private property and private ambitions to protect. And the party's not protecting them anymore. So they're starting to think, what are we going to do against the party? When you saw Hong Kong, so many of the Hong Kong billionaires never wanted to do anything against the Chinese Communist Party until what? Until the party started acting against them and their beloved city, which they had sort of thought kind of would never be taken over by the Communist Party. I don't know how they thought that, but they did. So once they saw the party was serious about conquering Hong Kong and crushing it and taking away everything they had, the party's building up its own resistance movement. So this is the wealthy figures at the top. And then when you have party decisions being made with companies with fake sets of books on Western capital markets with complete phony spreadsheets on everything, and now people around the world are realizing, hey, we're losing a ton of money by investing in the Chinese Communist Party. We're going to pull out. Now you have these houses of cards collapsing within China, reverberating around the world. So that's a good thing. That shows a real vulnerable point. And so on down the line. But some of that, I think one of the greatest things of all is where Xi Jinping is consolidating personal power almost completely to himself, which means that if he's going to take the credit for everything, he has to take the blame for everything. But if you have somebody like him, who everybody fears, who's afraid of Winnie the Pooh, then you have a guy with psychological issues that can be manipulated.
I thought you were going to say actually Winnie the Pooh is the most powerful person in China.
Well, I thought Mickey Mouse on the South Park episode was, but
that was disturbing.
Well, I was going to say, are we there yet, though? I mean, I feel like wealthy Chinese people have always been trying to get their money out of China. That's why they have all the issues with capital flight. And I think it's probably going to get worse now with the whole common prosperity line that Xi Jinping is pulling. And, he's fine with destroying Chinese tech companies and things like that in order to bring them under greater control of the party. But I feel like on the Western side, there's still a lot of kind of fantasy land thinking about, making money in China, JP Morgan going into China, Bridgewater, BlackRock, all these, financial institutions. Do you think we're going to get to the point where they kind of realize that this is not the way to go?
Maybe, but only after they lose a lot, and their shareholders start revolting, and people who have IRAs or pension funds or whatever that are invested in this, which most Americans do, whether they know it or not. We see what's been happening to the stock market recently. Part of that's related to China and COVID. I think if and when things get worse, there'll be a lot more shareholder revolts and other types of pushback from those who are losing a lot of money for China, and China has become a bad bet. So Xi Jinping was fine with these billionaires until he started destroying what they were building. He was fine as long as he was helping build it, but now that he's taken the other tack, this is where you have poles of resistance and divisions within the party that if we were smart on the outside, we would exploit it. We'd pay favorites with certain Chinese tycoons and not talk about, well, not avoid, but we like to focus on the plight of the individuals or different ethnic groups who are being repressed in China. That's really important to keep talking about. But we have to play games among the people who really still have their hands on levers of control inside the CCP, which is what we're not doing, and we should be.
We had a guest on a little while ago, Srđan Popović, who was a Serbian activist, and he talks about what he calls pillars of support. So, the financial elites are a pillar. The military is a pillar of support. The police are a pillar of support, and so on. And these different groups that are kind of propping up a regime in general, but in this case, the Communist Party. So what other pillars of support or what other groups are kind of like a nuts and bolts or a Jenga block that could be taken out that would cause problems for the party?
Well, you've got your big banks, you get your big media, your companies like Disney, NBC, other big media companies that don't permit criticism of the Chinese regime, and really the regime now tells them what to do instead of them using their own judgment about what not to do. There's more pushback against this. There's more public awareness thanks to COVID and thanks to the attention being brought on the plight of the Uyghurs and the attention of certain American athletes who are perfectly fine with slave labor being used to make the products that they have their names branded on. So there's more awareness for pushback in that regard. And then you have a lot of now people from Hong Kong who around the world now who are informing other people. They speak perfect English. They fit right into English-speaking societies around the world. They're able to get the word out a lot more about what's happened to them and their city. And they're starting to work now with people in Taiwan where they might not have done so before. And there's sympathy toward Taiwan because it's the little guy in all of this. People like an underdog. And so you've got a big bully getting ready to gang up on Taiwan the way it's been, so abusive toward everybody else. This is all behavior that the Chinese Communist Party is inflicting on itself by being aggressive in this fashion. And then the whole concern now over Russia and Ukraine also heightens awareness especially among Americans and Europeans because, well, if there's a crisis in Ukraine, what are we going to do about the crisis in Taiwan? We can't handle both crises effectively at the same time, especially if they go kinetic. So these are all concerns where people are starting to think, including people in Washington who don't really think in geostrategic terms, even though they talk about it. They are now really thinking seriously about it now and coming to quiet agreements and dialogues, even among their political opposites, about what we need to do.
Mike, you mentioned the idea of like playing off different people, like wealthy Chinese businessmen or people within the party against themselves. We've talked about a lot of power struggle stuff on our show before, but do you remember the longer Telegram thing that was going around maybe about a year ago or so, where an anonymous writer had written a piece for the Atlantic Council where they were essentially saying we shouldn't have a regime change in China, but we should get rid of Xi Jinping? So is that a concern that, like, if there is a power struggle within the CCP that brings down Xi Jinping, but the party itself could still survive and continue to do everything it's doing?
Right. Yeah. So there are groups. Former Secretary of State John Kerry has been quietly promoting this idea of building international pressure to get Xi Jinping removed from power in China. Now, that, to me, that's a really neat development because you're having now people who were generally very, very, very soft on the Chinese Communist Party now taking part in going against its leader. But they're not doing it for altruistic reasons. They're doing it more for financial reasons because Xi Jinping, instead of being a big moneymaker, looks like a big threat to those who were making so much money from him. There's no talk of taking down removing or dismantling or dividing up the Chinese Communist Party itself, given the nature of the party. And so that's a much bigger issue. It might be a relief valve to find a way to get Xi Jinping ousted by his own standing committee on the Politburo, but it's just going to bring in another communist who came up with him and through him and who's still part of the problem. You're not going to find a Chinese Gorbachev. But it wasn't, remember, Gorbachev wanted to save the Soviet Union and the Communist Party, and the Bush administration was trying to save those things as well by working with Gorbachev. They did not welcome the rise of Boris Yeltsin at all. They feared it. So sure, let's go along with that longer telegram idea and as baby steps toward isolating Xi Jinping within his own party and promoting his ouster. But really, we should not be satisfied with that at all, because the whole party represents a threat to the whole world as long as it's ruling, as long as it exists in any form.
Why was the U.S. trying to save the Soviet Union?
Because that's all they knew. So having been knowing some of the players at the time and working with them, Condoleezza Rice was then President Bush 41's National Security Council staffer to handle the Soviet Union. And she was really scared of what would happen if the Soviet Communist Party collapsed. And the whole Bush administration was, really most of Washington was. Could there be a nuclear war? Could there be the scattering of nuclear materials to terrorists around the world? Could some other terrible calamity happen? So it was that fear of the unknown and being content with what they do know that was motivating the Bush administration to try to save the Soviet Union. Remember, Bush gave that speech in Kiev, Ukraine, before the Soviet collapse, because Ukraine wanted independence from the Soviet Union. And Bush said, well, calm down, slow down now. Let's not be hasty about this. It was called the Chicken Kiev speech by its detractors. Condoleezza Rice wrote that speech, but that sort of set the mood for what the Bush administration was doing. And now there was a need also to sort of guide the collapse, because you can't necessarily have a foreign communist party, whether it's Soviet or Chinese, simply collapse on its own if it's a nuclear power. You want to guide it as it's falling down, at least in these guys, in these policymakers' view.